And my goal is probably to ask questions to help people think, to help people uh, evaluate data, and to help counter the influence of fascists, plain and simple, and also to help build a critical mass of people who do more than talk the talk, who are interested in walking the walk, to reinforce voting rights, to build a coalition that will support solving the problems that beset the world and solving the threats to humanity's collective existence, but more specifically, um, threatening the existence of children, because climate change and associated environmental problems, and even non-associated environmental problems, are really the responsibility of adults to deal with now as caretakers of an environment that our children will have to exist in. But I also wanted to point out the disproportionate harm that climate change may well inflict on nations with less resources to accommodate to changing conditions. So places with less building infrastructure are more likely to be irreparably damaged or to have more widespread devastation caused by floods, hurricanes, climate associated earthquakes. So Chris is here, and Chris says, hello, Dav. Hello to Chris. I've got to make my sentences a little bit smaller, but you know me, it's a constant work in progress, and it's a complicated goal to articulate, to want to be good, not only parents, but good citizens and good global citizens, to overcome our own impoverished human natures and to use the wealth of human ingenuity and human uh, collaborative abilities. So we want to use our better selves to solve problems that face us, including self-generated problems. And we want to work together to be able to spurn and counter the more malignant, destructive, nihilistic elements of human nature. That is to say, the tendency to be so tribalistic that we start demonizing or scapegoating certain ethnic groups or racial groups, and that we exist peaceably in a multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy in the United States, and more broadly speaking, coexist peacefully in the world. So Pablo is here saying hello from Los Angeles. Hello, hello. Chris wants to know, what do I think about Facebook, and what do I think it is anonymous? Is Facebook still down? I don't care, because I got off Facebook, which is what I typically recommend other people do as well. We have to carve out other pathways to human connection and forming groups and doing things like that, because Facebook is the CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, is an unrepentant, divisive, uh, conscienceless grifter, really, an opportunist who's known that the technology he developed, that the platform he developed, had characteristics that lent itself to genocide, characteristics that lent itself to division and conflict. And he did not change that, did not adjust the platform in order to discourage ethnic conflict, to discourage hate speech, etc. He makes noises to indicate he supports peaceful democracies, but he hasn't wielded power in an appropriate way, and power just does not belong with Mark Zuckerberg. So I always argue for people to delete Facebook and to pull power away from Mark Zuckerberg one fragment, one molecule at a time. Chris got off Facebook 5 years ago. Good for you, yes. And so Facebook's down, and there's also a Facebook whistleblower who is being open tonight with 60 Minutes in an interview about the fact that Facebook is self-aware of its dangerous potential, that there are studies, internal reports that have been compiled to indicate that Facebook's lack of ability to police hate speech, Facebook's algorithms recommending groups have been very useful to funnel people in towards groups, even if those groups are hate groups, and that death and conflict and war has resulted as a consequence. So ethnic cleansing in Myanmar was amplified and was exacerbated by activity on Facebook. Pablo is here and says, Chris, it's good to see you again. So it's always nice when you have HAPS family members catching up in the comments section. That's nice to facilitate that. The image I have up on screen, I can see Vladimir Zelensky at the top of it, but what he's accused of in the Panama Papers is relatively less. Although it depends on the size of the company. Vladimir Zelensky, you might be familiar with the name, president of Ukraine. When he was running for election, he ran on a campaign of moving Ukraine away from corruption. And the secondary losses that people might not consider if you're not familiar with the effects of corruption, but the general economic stagnation and economic regression that occurs when you don't get the benefits of a free market, you just get the cover story of a free market, and really nepotism and under the table deals flourish, so that there's no healthy tenders for projects. It's just all people passing each other money under the table. And Vladimir Zelensky is alleged in the Pandora Papers, which have just been leaked to the world, that he sold 25% of an offshore company he was invested in to a friend of his who now works for him. So that does sound a bit dodgy, but I'm curious to know what the actual figure is. If you own 25% of a company, but it was a tiny little startup, then that's less significant. The other info from the Pandora Papers is that, yes, a lot of associates of Vladimir Putin are listed in there. He apparently just uses people as wallets. So if you're a Vladimir Putin friend, you might get billions of dollars in your bank account mysteriously. But if Putin wants to spend that money, then you let him. You are a human wallet for your friend, the most powerful, no, the most wealthy, unchecked, aggressive man in the world. Pablo gave me a 1 award. Why, thank you, Pablo. What's that for? It's for being the one. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. So that's what the ICIJ stands for. And yes, the Pandora Papers is supposed to be the biggest leak out of, I remember hearing the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, all links that have intimated at Putin's enormous wealth and the complicity of various other heads of state in shifting money around the world, buying chalets in France and Switzerland, and just generally avoiding tax and avoiding contributing to societies, instead contributing to the expansion of their own bank accounts and the maintenance of their own lifestyles as some kind of aristocratic global jet setters who don't care if the world burns and who don't have any sense of patriotic compulsion to pay tax as per the laws of their country. They would rather shift around assets, make use of international accountants who help them hide their money from the scrutiny of tax authorities. Stephanie Grisham is trending because she regrets enabling a culture of dishonesty at the White House. She's the quiet press secretary who never gave any public press conferences, who did make appearances on Fox News. And what does she claim? That it was like working at a madhouse, that people were afraid of being yelled at by President Trump, and so people sometimes hid information from him, that he yelled at then First Lady Melania Trump for wearing a jacket saying, "I don't really care, do you?" when she went to the desert to visit some of the detention centers, which were housing separated children and separated family members who had been forcibly taken apart, taken away from each other under the instructions of then Admiral John Kelly, who was serving as chief of staff to President Trump and who helped devise that policy of family separation in order to use it as a deterrent to people who might wish to migrate to the United States via the non-paperwork pathway, via the more desperate pathway of just bodily turning up to the United States. You can't claim asylum at an embassy in another country. You have to be present in the United States in order to claim asylum. So you have various undocumented migrants who seek to do that. People might be a little bit mad that Stephen Miller, the architect of that family separation policy, is still getting paid by the government, but his salary at present is only $10,000 a year, his government salary, because he works for the office of the former president. That is to say, as per usual, when a president leaves office, they have $150,000 to spend for a period of 2.5 years on salaries and things of people they want to help them do their official former president business. And so in Trump's case, that includes a cast of very disreputable characters, such as Stephen Miller, a principal architect of separating babies and infants and children from their caregivers or parents, as a immigration deterrent measure, much to the consternation of much of the American public. And even people who defended Trump were often defending him by saying it's not true, they haven't done that. Because the reality that children and babies were being separated from their parents, that parents were being told, your children are being taken for a bath and they'll be brought back to you soon, and then were not being brought back, or that children, parents were sleeping with their children between their legs at nighttime in detention centers out of fear that the guards would come while they were sleeping and take the children away. And that the Trump administration also declined to keep appropriate records during that time, so that it was always underestimated how many children exactly were put through the emotional torture and psychological harm and intellectual harm of being torn from their caregiver networks at an emotionally, developmentally formative time in their lives, in a way that's likely to impair their educational attainments, their future relationships, their sense of self. A lot of things developmental psychologists said were likely to be seriously damaged by a policy of forcible government separation of children from caregivers. I can tell I'm a bit sleepy. You might have missed me, I have been not very well, but luckily not COVID. Got tested, whole family got tested. We had a whole lot of boxes arrive. You can still see some of the boxes, or at least the empty boxes there, and some shelves that haven't been put up yet. And it's all been a bit full on here, so my apologies if anybody missed me, and I hope you're happy to see me back. Brian is missing his Instagram and Facebook. Well, there you go. Maybe that's why we have some people listening to us today. Go to bookmarks because we do have some interesting things to listen to. Tim Ryan is a contender for the Ohio Senate seat, and he notes that workers are paying their tax. They don't have much of a choice about that. And then the wealthy and well-connected play by their own sets of rules, and that it's time to change it. I saw one framing of this as saying, oh, this could be embarrassing for President Biden. How so? These are networks that are occurring all around the world, and Biden has been very adamant in his speeches that his administration will tackle networks of international crime and corruption. So he's got a good opportunity to try and do that. Somebody points out that none of this should be a surprise to us, because as you can see from this Guardian title here, in 2008, Facebook actually funded, Russian Russian executives helped to fund Facebook and Twitter through an investor in Jared Kushner's business. I might open up that article. So we just have we can quickly engage with it. So the person standing next to Mark Zuckerberg there, who's that? Yuri Milner holds a stake in Twitter and Facebook. Well, at least Twitter reiterated today that Trump does not have permission to come back on to Twitter, even if he runs for president again, even if he's reelected, which is reassuring because Donald Trump was sometimes referred to as the economic engine of Twitter. His presence on Twitter generated a lot of chatter and a lot of user engagement. So they clearly drew a firm line in the sand after the insurrection when Donald Trump was continuing to incite violence on that platform. And they made a hard resolve not to allow him back on the platform under any circumstances. So Better Weld here and says, good to see you, Davina. Yes, good to see you too. It's very nice. Look how comfortable I am using my name once Trump's not in power. Look at the way in which having a dangerous Russian asset in office, controlling or appointing people to the Justice Department, just made things more scary, and some of that fear has definitely subsided. Some people are impatient with the Justice Department. I'm personally encouraged by the idea that they're systematically prosecuting all of the people who participated in the January 6th insurrection. And remembering that those people did feel that they were acting on legitimate orders from a president, from a commander-in-chief, and that some of them were more violent than others. I'm glad that there is some ongoing efforts to get justice in that situation then. Has anybody heard that there's a report out from the Crew gang? And the Crew are Citizens for Responsible and Ethical Governance in Washington, I think. But they obtained 7 hours of audio from the park police on the day of January the 6th. So that includes audio of messages being passed to the park police, that even as they were waiting for react teams to come help them after a park police officer was hit in the head with a baton, they were told to just let it happen and to continue to monitor the situation rather than intervene in any way. So something that really highlights what white privilege is, and that is that racist Donald Trump supporters seeking to overturn the election results were granted the protection of park police being instructed to let it happen and to just monitor. And that comment was made multiple times on the 7 hours worth of audio recordings obtained by a Freedom of Information request from the, let's find out their name. I'm calling them Crew. Crew is definitely the acronym, but let's, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. There you go. leading ethics watchdog that takes relentless legal and investigative actions, holding people in power to account. So it's a nonprofit founded in 2003 with headquarters in Washington, D.C. Now, it's very important to me to believe that this channel promotes pragmatic steps to protect democracy, protect our children, protect the planet. So I saw of someone today arguing that rather than just complain on Twitter or talk to an echo chamber, they volunteer some of their time with an organization called Black Votes Matter. Now, the thing that appeals to me about that statement is that an organization called Black Votes Matter that helps marginalized Black people deal with the logistical obstacles thrown in their path by various mischievous Republican legislation that exists to discourage and deter Black voters from exercising any type of power in elections. Those obstacles can be overcome with care and attention sometimes, and we could all do that. It's the least we owe to the situation where Texas is passing laws, Florida is passing laws, specifically to make it more difficult to vote if you're an elderly Black person who was born, say, outside of America's hospital system, who would then have to pay additional money to get the type of ID that would be deemed acceptable in a framework of Republican legislation saying that they're enhancing election security by making it more difficult for people without certain IDs to vote. And the thing is, their research shows them very well which type of voters will find it more difficult to pass their newly introduced rules. Yes, so Black votes matter. Because I think we should all volunteer with that or something like that. Fund Black voters matter. Our work, our purpose, take action. Text banking, there you go. Now that is something that people can do and channel their energy into. I'm going to bring it up on screen. And maybe we need a tiny nap. I'm not going to get one there, am I? No nap for me. But my body's still recovering. So this is the, take action, see how you can get involved. Basically, Black voters are often targeted by Republicans because they're people who often understand the mealy-mouthed sanctimony of Republicans is really a cover story for passing a lot of legislation to attract subsidies and tax cuts and tax breaks for wealthy people, including wealthy farmers. Lots of subsidies and lots of financial help for communities that are often white and that are often already wealthy. And yes, so when people say, I don't understand how people vote for Republicans, can they be so gullible? Look, they're often voting to preserve a strong white supremacist influence in government, and that white supremacist influence does benefit them, and they know that. So even though for some, voting for Republicans is really deleterious to their life outcomes. So their rural hospitals close, they can't get the protection from a mask mandate or a vaccine mandate because Republicans are currently running with a Trump-inspired contrarian position on public health, and that position involves agitating that masks and vaccine mandates are just or are a government overreach, and that fits in well to their tried and tested argument that you shouldn't let governments come in and say tax corporations more, because what you really need to be doing is opposing Antifa and opposing Black Lives Matter and making sure that heritage or legacy Americans receive a lion's share of any benefits or assistance. And if they can't have that, if people still keep making noises about equality, then it's better for no one to have those benefits. The same type of motivating energy that caused a lot of white Americans to pour acid in their public swimming pools rather than share them with Black Americans after desegregation laws were passed by the Supreme Court. Also tired. Someone called Raven is here, and Raven says hello from Cleveland. Hello, Raven. So yes, this website that I have up is blackvotersmatterfund.org. I'm going to click on take action. What is their voting tool block? Oh, this is where you can register to vote or request absentee ballots. Oh, check your registration status. That's really important. Get election reminders so that you never miss an election again. The 2020 census, that's a little bit out of date because that's over. What happens if you click volunteer? Oh, you can get information on upcoming volunteer and training opportunities. Phone banking, texting, postcard writing, social media campaigning, fundraiser, or other. Well, that's handy. I'm glad I connected with that. Of course, sometimes I promote Tracy Abrams' charity as well, or nonprofit. What's hers? Hers is called something like Fair Fight. All right. Okay. Andrew Yang leaving the Democratic Party because he has sour grapes. Babies have 15 times more microplastics in their bodies than adults, a new pilot study has found. It was a small study. They looked at poop of multiple adults and some babies, and the babies had more microplastics in their feces, indicating that maybe they were sucking on more plastic things and getting more plastic microfragments in their bloodstream and in their body from sucking on dummies or crawling through carpets that have plastic components. Senator Whitehouse, the Democratic Party, has noted that in 2050, that's the year when there will be more waste plastic floating in the Earth's oceans by mass than there will be living fish. So that is a concern, and we'll keep on that as a topic. He wants something called the Reduce Act to make plastic polluters pay. That would be nice. Of course, a lot of plastic is derived from petrochemical products. So people like the Koch brothers, or the surviving Koch brother, Charles Koch. Which Koch brother is left alive? Which Koch brother died? Which Koch brother is still alive? Okay, so David died and Charles is left. And he died at the age of 29. So it's Charles Koch and David Koch, while he was alive, give a lot of money in terms of scholarships and think tank funding and donations to politicians, all to essentially counter the influence of civil rights activists and environmental activists. They would rather people were in conflict and opposing pro-human policies and pro-multi-plural democracy policies because they would rather pay less tax and they would rather have their taxes contribute purely to the military whilst everything else be privatized. Public education, everything should be a toll road, according to them. Just having big pool of vassal-like serfs to squeeze for additional riches on their part. It's the distasteful sort of end game for them, I think. Heavenly Dew says she's listening in from Dallas. Hello, Heavenly Dew. Thanks for listening. All right, next. Covered microplastics. Oh, Representative Jamie Raskin, who is, what's MD? Maryland. He's from Maryland, and he's on the House Judiciary Committee in the House. He says we need reform to protect ourselves because with the January the 6th insurrection, of course, an unsuccessful coup can just turn into a practice run for an improved coup effort. So I know Trump isn't at the helm anymore, but they're still quite motivated to overthrow democracy. And they're still quite righteously motivated in that they believe they're doing the right and necessary thing to protect heritage America from the ability to vote for Democrats and their political opposites, counterparts. Yes. So let's see what do they say. We've learned from the John Eastman memo, a memo that a conservative constitutional lawyer wrote to try and justify Mike Pence gaveling Donald Trump in as the victor of the election and saying we're going to throw out the results from 7 states. And yes. Greg Sargent, a writer for the Washington Post, notes that the election process is full of serious vulnerabilities that could well be exploited by future bad actors who are willing to go through with it. So who saved us from a successful coup on January the 6th? There was Nancy Pelosi, who had the intestinal fortitude to reconvene Congress and still vote or still count the Electoral College votes on that day of January the 6th, because Trump's invading coup of armed insurrectionists, they were sent to the Capitol to stir things up, give Trump an excuse to declare martial law, give John Eastman and others a quote to say, well, now there's a delay, we can spend more time insisting that these electoral college totals have to be challenged, and that 7 states, Donald Trump said their results weren't accurate, so we clearly have to throw those results out and start again, or just any number of ways in which the legitimate will of the American majority, as expressed through the somewhat corrupted prism of the electoral college system, that at least, they did it. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won that presidential election. And yes. Okay, so we now know that there are a large number of Republican politicians, Raskin told me, who would do precisely what Trump was asking Pence to do. What did Trump ask Pence to do? To bang his gavel and pronounce Trump the winner of the 2020 election. People who followed Kristen Sinema into the toilet, or into the bathroom rather, they want us to know something. One of them said, you have to understand, we tried all the normal ways to talk to her. You cannot get a meeting. Her office is closed. Her voicemail inbox is full. We cannot afford to buy tickets to her fundraisers. And she has not had a town hall in 3 years. Kristen Sinema is one of the least accessible and least transparent members of Congress. She has not held a press conference, so we don't even know why she is opposing the reconciliation bill. People have been trying to get Kristen Sinema to attend a town hall since at least April, and they have made over 1 million constituent calls. So yes, Kristen Sinema is making time to meet with very fancy corporate donors, and is giving off every indication that she is a corrupted, sold-out individual who is taking it on board as her job to sabotage the Build Back Better Act as much as possible. shape, or form by powerful, wealthy donors, particularly in the petrochemical industries, who don't want there to be subsidies for renewable energy, etc. Okay. What's AL stand for? That's Alabama, isn't it? They filed a federal suit to unpack Alabama District 7. On the example right, that would comfortably elect 2 black candidates of choice and is much less gerrymandered than the current GOP map, which is on the left, which stuffs all black voters into one seat. So I guess that seat is District 1, because that is a weird shape. If you look and see this kind of peninsula from District 7 coming down into District 1, indicating that, yep, they're condensing all of the black voters in one place. And I think originally that was achieved because some black leaders didn't oppose those type of efforts, because they were happy for black voters' influence to be concentrated to at least get one black representative elected. Well, now I guess it's not such a novel thing anymore, and you can count on a degree of support for black candidates amongst white voters who have been trained to be repulsed by the kind of racism that makes some voters reject people of black skin. Oh, somebody from Staines upon Thames is writing to me, which means they're in England. That's exciting. So yes, if there is a successful federal suit to unpack a district, then that would be nice. Oh, so great. This is an important thread because John Eastman, who I was just referencing, who wrote a memo on behalf of someone in the Trump administration outlining the steps that could be taken if the January the 6th vote count was disrupted, that they could then throw out the results from 7 states and have Mike Pence gavel in Donald Trump to a second term. So John Eastman apparently isn't just a conservative constitutional lawyer. He's got a group running that's intimately affiliated with the World Congress of Families, a radical anti-LGBT group funded by Russian oligarchs close to Vladimir Putin. Eastman and others have been feted in lavish conferences in Russia that are part of Vladimir Putin's destabilizing efforts. So that is very important to keep in mind, that America is still effectively at Cold War, in a state of Cold War with Russia, and that Vladimir Putin likes that to be so, and that there's an unofficial coalition between Vladimir Putin, petrochemical billionaire, and other petrochemical billionaires in the United States. And they're happy for America to have destabilizing levels of right-wing, far-right white militia and people who are exposed to such heavy-duty propaganda that they literally believe that the Black Lives Matter movement is a terrorist organization and that Antifa is large and powerful. People believe that, and they are being exposed to violent propaganda that makes them feel like they need to avenge Donald Trump and avenge conservative viewpoints. All right, everybody. Well, I've been talking for a little while. I know there's always more to talk about, but if you're not following Matthew Sheffield, I recommend it. He's a former conservative journalist who's realized that conservatives are often pushing for things that don't really align with their professed values. Oh, Marjorie Taylor Greene thinks that 9/11 didn't really happen. She doesn't believe a plane actually crashed into the Pentagon on 9/11 and called it a so-called plane. Well, let's have a listen.
But we had witnessed 9/11, right? We had witnessed 9/11, the attack in New York, plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, and the so-called plane that into the Pentagon. It's odd. There's never any evidence shown for a plane in the Pentagon. But anyway, it's not 9/11 conspiracy. But 9/11, right? 9/11,
Okay.
the terror.
So she's not saying all of the planes. She's just saying that there's a so-called plane crashing into the Pentagon. So she's calling that particular crash a made-up story. I think over 100 people, I think 114 people died in the Pentagon when a plane crashed just on the side of the building. Oh, and this also matches up with this. This is Lynn Wood, remember, as Trump's lawyer. One of the lawyers advocating for the result of Biden's election win to be thrown out of court in favor of giving Donald Trump a second term. Let's see what he has to say about 9/11.
9/11, you want to talk about that? Let's talk about CGI. You know what that is? Computer graphics generated images. You know what CGI is? You know what deep fake videos are? I know you know what photoshopping is. 2001, the estimate was there was $3.5 trillion. That was the estimate. That had been stolen from the defense budget. They were going to have hearings starting on November the 12th to discuss that money that had been stolen and was missing. That was your money, by the way. And then all of a sudden, on 9/11, appeared to be a plane hit one building, what appeared to be a plane hit another building. Then later that night, another building fell down that wasn't hit by a dead-gum thing. It was the building that went down, Building 7, that had all the paperwork in it with respect to the missing money. And the Pentagon got hit by a missile. There were no plane fragments found anywhere on any of the sites, New York, Pennsylvania, the Pentagon. And they just happened to hit where the papers were about the missing money. There are no coincidences. We got played. We got played by people that are so evil that for money, they killed 2,800 Americans on that day, including policemen and firefighters. If George Bush 43 is not already in hell, then he needs to go to jail before he goes to hell, because he is a criminal.
What? Okay. Well, George, that's some interesting listening. Okay, so George W. Bush was president at 9/11, and he's still alive, and his father died in the last 2 years, George H.W. Bush. But Lynn Wood's talking as if George W. Bush is already dead and suggests that he should be burning in hell if he's not already, and also accepts that nearly 3,000 people died. I think it was over 3,000 people, but anyway, he accepts that 2,800 people died, says this is just a consequence of some kind of stunt to detonate an explosion in those buildings in order to cover up your missing money. So he's telling his audience, you specifically were stolen from on 9/11, and the evidence about that money theft was lit on fire, or was in building 7, which is an adjacent building that fell down after, I guess, the reverberations and the fires from 2 aeroplanes, 2 commercial jetliners, tragically and atrociously being flown into the 2 buildings of the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. So I think some people would be repelled by that content, and I'm hoping that there are some Republicans who were holding their nose to vote for Trump, or who were buying into the ideology at one point that COVID was made up and only Trump was prepared to center the economy and prioritize people's economic well-being. They bought into that, and they bought into that hope as well that COVID would end with the re-election of President Trump, or that COVID would end at least with the election, because it was just a fabrication, according to them, of the Democratic Party in order to disparage then President Trump. TPT, then President Trump, the former guy. I'm hoping that some of those people are repelled by how extreme the Republican Party has to be in order to continue to feed the narrative that Trump has backed himself into a corner with, that COVID wasn't real and therefore why bother getting vaccinated against it? If Trump's not in power offering you the vaccination, then of course they're against it, because it's divisive to be against it. It will undermine Joe Biden. One man came out and spoke very specifically to a CNN journalist to say that he wouldn't, even though he'd been hospitalized for COVID previously, he wouldn't take the vaccine because he was angry at the pharmaceutical companies for shafting his president by not bringing out the vaccines prior to the election. So he specifically, personally, was exposing himself to risk of reinfection with COVID and further negative outcomes, just to get revenge at a personal level for what he thought was the theft of an election victory, or the theft of popularity, election winning popularity from Trump, if the vaccines had emerged prior to November. What's the election date? Is it November the 3rd? So there's that. I hope that this extremism helps to shrink the Republican Party, because certainly what's being done to expand the Republican Party or artificially shrink the Democratic Party is Republicans in Republican-controlled state legislatures putting in obstacles that will disproportionately impact minority voters, and specifically Black voters whose older family members, older Black voters who may have found it difficult to get a birth certificate issued to them at the time of their birth, and who may not have the discretionary funding to pay for all of the paperwork that would need to be issued to them in order to qualify for the Republican legislative tweaks that have said you can't vote anymore unless you can supply certain things. I know that American paperwork is not easy to do. I've been jumping through the hoops of American paperwork for some time now. So I know that I, for example, could not just vote as a new arrival. I'll have to go through the citizenship process. And I know about the layers and layers of bureaucracy that are required to jump through to do almost anything. And so I always want to speak to that now when Republicans try to claim that it's easy for undocumented migrants to vote, or they're just trying to tighten things up to make elections safer. They're not. They're trying to make elections less safe and less democratic. And I think it's so important to clearly articulate what Republicans' intentions are, because they'll first of all keep trying to lie into existence a cover story, or lie to maximize the buy-in of gullible, semi-decent Americans, or gullible, partially decent Americans who keep voting for indecent Republicans, but who do also want to have a safe America. They're just being taught that safety is associated with votes for Republicans, when Republicans have been quite good at showing their butt lately in the last few years about how unsafe they're willing to make Americans in order to advance the goals of their powerful donors, their powerful, wealthy, petrochemical giant donors. They're willing to facilitate the death and impoverishment of millions of Americans in natural disasters by sabotaging climate change legislation. They're willing to defund hospitals. They're willing to undermine public health measures, oppose mask wearing or vaccine mandates, or just vaccine efforts generally, vaccine rollouts, vaccine distribution programs. They're willing to oppose all of those things in order to keep feeding a tribalistic identity monster of Democrats are always bad, and so everything they try to do for the public is always bad, and so you have to define yourself in opposition to those satanistic baby-eating Democrats. Now, I learned something today from historian Heather Cox Richardson, who's always very informative, and she noted that it was a very specific point in history that Republican embrace of the anti-abortion movement first arose, and it was in 1972 when Richard Nixon wanted to increase public support, which was waning after Kent shooting, when there was an anti-Vietnam War protest at Kent University, and I think the National Guard opened fire on some students, killing, I'm not sure how many students they killed. I think killing a minimum of 2 students. So support for Nixon was falling as a consequence of the barbarity of that event and that action on the part of the National Guard, who were obeying a Richard Nixon prerogative of suppress anti-war protests. So Richard Nixon was specifically trying to attract Catholic Democrats, Democratic voting Catholic people, to attract them to the Republican side, and to do so by centering and amplifying anti-abortion rhetoric, because it's an easy, contentious issue to rile people up about, to say, yes, sure, women claim to want bodily autonomy, but they can have it just by never having sex. That's the limits of their bodily autonomy. They should always be able to say no to sex. And if rape happens or incest happens or contraceptive failure happens, doesn't matter. It's out of our hands. Women, you just have to obey the prerogatives of nature and continue with an inadvertent, accidental, violent pregnancy. Those were options. I'm not saying pregnancies are all those things at the one time, but rapes that result in pregnancy are violent pregnancies. Rapes, pregnancies that result from incest are still also a result of emotionally violent, coercive activity. And inadvertent pregnancies that result from contraceptive failure or contraceptive mistakes, or a failure to engage in any contraceptive activity at all, so a product of ignorance, those are also mistakes that women should be able to have the bodily autonomy to do something about before a pregnancy becomes a sentient baby. And you can argue that babies at a later stage of pregnancy have a degree of sentience. I'm happy to hear and make that argument, but that just makes it a big medical decision, because if you're still growing a baby inside yourself, then even if the baby's sentient, if it's jeopardizing your life, or you have cancer and you require chemotherapy treatment that will jeopardize the life of the baby, you still need legal protection to say the woman is allowed to bring that pregnancy to an end in order to preserve her own health. So there's that. I'm firmly in the camp of granting women a basic modicum of human rights. But obviously it was a power play by Richard Nixon to try and co-opt loyalty from Democratic voting Catholics by trying to make their Catholic identity central to their political voting identity. Does that make sense, everybody? I better go. Except this is a really fascinating thread that I'd like to introduce everyone to from a ex-editor from Chicago Tribune and Sun-Times. So he's now retired. He's allowed to have opinions. And he notes that when he edited political stories, he went so far as to count the quotes from Republicans and Democrats, thinking an equal number would make us fairer. I didn't think I was helping either party. I thought I was helping the readers. I was wrong. He said, if you look back 3 or 4 decades, you see many corrupt politicians in both parties. scandals like Abscam and Keating 5 were mostly Democratic, but in recent decades it's obvious the GOP is more unethical and anti-democratic, which means treating the parties equally really helps Republicans. So Hillary Clinton may have mishandled emails. George W. Bush lied to get us into a war. Both were bad, but one was way worse. The media's self-assigned goal of treating Republicans and Democrats equally has compelled them to pump up coverage of Democratic scandals to make that appear equivalent to Republican fairness, yes. Republicans have overwhelmed the media with corruption. They've created scandal fatigue, prompting journalists to do something I call ethics norming. That's when something that would have been a huge scandal in the past is considered normal now. The Republicans have pulled off quite a trick. If news is defined as something unusual happening, GOP corruption is not news because the party is so widely corrupt. Some media have turned off their outrage impulse and decided that corruption is normal. What's needed is new framing, not party-oriented, but democracy-oriented, truth-oriented. The media shouldn't elevate lies in the interest of fairness. Yes, the media should be fair to the readers, to the facts, but not to the two-party system. Fair to our democracy. We are now in the midst of an assault on democracy, unlike any our country has ever seen. Any journalist who doesn't frame their reports in that context is doing a grievous disservice to our country. Wow, so that was published on September the 27th, and it's been circulated quite a lot. So by the end of his thread, that's 23.9 thousand likes and 4.8 thousand retweets, which is a degree of virality which that topic deserves and those admissions deserve. So if you see it, if you see this thread, I'm going to retweet some of it now on my platform. Please feel free to share it and contribute to to its broad dissemination. There you go. So that's all me for today. Thank you so much for listening. I've been talking for an hour. Need to get some more ads or music interludes or guests. I have a friend who has a podcast called Back to the Vax, and she has a female co-host. It was so pleasant listening to them talk, and they interviewed a doctor as well about the necessity to protect children by having enough mask mandates and vaccine mandates so that unvaccinated teachers aren't in the classroom exposing children who are too young to be vaccinated to a very contagious virus that is deadly and for a small subset. And the thing about a very contagious virus, that no matter how much you try to emphasize the smallness of the subset of the people who end up dead, a very contagious virus that infects a lot of people ends up with a numerically large, an undesirably numerically large number of people who die or incur injuries or disabilities as a consequence of infection with this particular disease, regardless of what high 99% of people survive it. That doesn't matter. Something that's super duper contagious means you have to act to prevent the ranks of the dead swelling to unconscionable levels, like the 700,000 death milestone that America has just passed. And that includes a number of children that have been orphaned by this disease as well. And a largely now preventable disease in the United States because everybody can get a free vaccination if they choose, if they haven't been sufficiently immersed in anti-vaccination propaganda, that their risk-benefit calculations have been thrown off and they have become more afraid of adverse vaccine events than of the genuinely very severe and more widespread adverse consequences associated with a significant subset of COVID sufferers. So yes, mathematicians have such an important role to play alongside of epidemiologists and science communicators, doctors. Thank you to everybody for listening. Take care and hope to talk to you soon. Bye.